Today's story takes place in the tiny town of Saint-Louis-de-Blandford, Quebec, which is located on the Bencancour River in Arthabaska County in the Centre de Quebec region, an area known for its high concentration of cranberry bogs. The majority of cranberry agriculture in the province of Quebec occurs in and around the town, with 40 cranberry producers concentrated around the village. St. Louis also receives 9,000 visitors a year for 3 short weeks during cranberry harvest, in late September to early October. But cranberries is not what this story is about. This story is about food of a different sort. So I thought for today's video I would change things up a little bit and cover a famous Canadian heist. And if you clicked on this video, you're probably wondering, maple syrup? Seriously? Is there like a murder mystery tied to this story or something? No, there's no murder mystery. Nobody dies in this story, but I promise the murder stories will be back next week. And there's something that feels really wrong about saying that out loud. I've just been researching a lot of really dark cases lately, and I needed to film something a bit different just to lighten the mood a bit. So this story is about an infamous Canadian heist. It's basically a group of rebels banding together to fight against the evil maple syrup mafia. You heard it right. It's an exceptionally weird story. When news that millions of dollars worth of maple syrup had been stolen from a Quebec warehouse, the public was both amazed and amused. The story immediately went viral. How could these thieves have gone unnoticed as they drained 6 million pounds of syrup from the warehouse? Why would these guys steal maple syrup in the first place? Is there even a black market for maple syrup? That would be a yes. And how does anyone even unload and sell that much black market maple syrup? The provincial police threw everything into this investigation, executing search warrants in 3 different provinces and the US. The heist was also the butt of many late-night comic jokes. But maple syrup is no joke in Canada, especially in Quebec. This is the story of the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist. Our story begins on June 27, 2011, in the small town of Saint-Louis-de-Blandford, and a man named Avik Caron, age 39. Avik's wife was part owner of a building which was a former hardwood flooring factory in Saint-Louis-de-Blandford. She told him on that day that the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, or FPAC for short, needed to rent warehouse space immediately to store their backup supply of maple syrup. There was a huge surplus of maple syrup from that year's harvest. The region had more on its hands than it could hope to sell. And the existing warehouses were already filled to capacity. The warehouse in St. Louis-de-Blandford was the perfect storage space for the FPAC, as it was about 30 minutes away from the main storage house in Laurierville. However, security was horrible. The building was far from Fort Knox. There was no alarm system, no security cameras, and security was basically delegated to a foreman who lived in the apartment on site. Avik knew all this, and it wasn't long before thousands of barrels containing maple syrup were unloaded into the warehouse, and he was scheming to steal them. And also, the FPAC didn't exactly do their homework on the warehouse owner or her spouse. If they had bothered to run background checks, they would have found that Avik was being sued for running a scheme as an insurance agent. And this wasn't the first time he found himself on the wrong side of the law. He had a criminal record, pleading guilty in 2011 to charges of fraud, but didn't end up serving any jail time for this previous conviction. The court granted him an absolution, and about 3 months later, the world-famous maple syrup heist of the century began. Maple syrup in Quebec is a highly regulated industry. And beyond the jokes about sticky-fingered bandits, the heist brought attention to the FPAC's unexpected involvement in the growing underground syrup market. When the Federation changed the rules of the game in the early 2000s, it basically helped to create prohibition-style smuggling and illegal maple syrup sales within Quebec. So what exactly is the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, or FPAC for short? What do they do, and why is there so much hatred for them? The FPAC has been managing maple syrup supply in Quebec since 1966. It's a government-approved, private organization that strictly regulates the production, marketing, and sale of all wholesale maple syrup in Quebec. Like I said before, Quebec takes their maple syrup very seriously. But in 2002, the FPAC tightened its supply management system. It introduced quotas and a single sales agency, and almost immediately a thriving black market developed. The supply management was apparently put into place to ensure that producers were getting a fair price for their product. Basically what it is, if you have a maple syrup business in Quebec and you sell wholesale, these sales have to go through the Federation. And from each barrel, the organization takes a $54 fee. The FPAC also manages and maintains a strategic reserve of maple syrup, officially known as the International Strategic Reserve, which was created in the year 2000. The reserve was created to cover market demand in case of a fluctuation in maple syrup supply. The reserve is also managed as a government-approved cartel to control global maple syrup prices and supply, and has been called the OPEC of the maple syrup world by The Economist. In Quebec, each sugar maker is assigned a production limit by the FPAC. If there's a good harvest year, the excess syrup is taken by the Federation and stored in the Global Strategic Maple Syrup Reserve to be sold on consignment in years when production falls. But Quebec sugar makers don't get paid for their extra product until the FPAC decides to sell it from the reserve. So producers can often wait years to see profits from this stockpile. The FPAC is also responsible for marketing of Quebec maple syrup all over the world. To boost maple syrup's profile nationally and abroad, the marketing branch of the Federation created a maple mascot named Syrupacool. He's referred to as the smartest superhero in the galaxy and who looks like a drop of maple syrup. According to the National Post, he gets his lightning-quick reflexes and unlimited supply of brilliant ideas from living amongst the maple trees. Kids can visit the site kids.maplefromcanada.ca to learn all about Syrupacool and the wonderful world of maple syrup. The FPAC also hosts culinary competitions within Quebec, but also the US and Japan, using Quebec maple syrup, of course. The FPAC's aim is to spread consumer awareness of their product in order to increase product consumption and Quebec's maple syrup exports. And it's mostly because of the FPAC's intense marketing that you'll find Quebec maple syrup on shelves all over the world. The FPAC represents 7,400 maple syrup producers and 13,500 farmers in Quebec. Back in 2011, the FPAC produced 94% of Canadian maple syrup and 77% of the world's supply. So Quebec, by far, is the world's largest maple syrup producer. The FPAC would argue that they exist to regulate syrup prices and to keep those prices stable. But basically, the FPAC is a private, legal, mafia-like organization for maple syrup. And it has the complete blessing of the Quebec provincial government. And the tiny amount that sugar makers are allowed to sell directly to retail is also heavily regulated by the Federation. In total, the FPAC holds about $240 million worth of syrup in the Global Strategic Maple Syrup Reserve in Laurierville, Quebec. But the Maple Syrup's Federation rules has its critics. And for many, the ridiculous oversight goes too far. In theory, the Federation's main purpose is to manage the production and supply of maple syrup to maintain a healthy income for its members. But in reality, they decide who can tap maple trees and how many farmers are allowed to tap, and the FPAC forces producers to sell all syrup through them. Basically, the FPAC's critics think they're an evil cartel. They also investigate, pursue, and find syrup producers who question their control. They also have been known to randomly search producers' sugar shacks and impound what they consider to be illegal syrup, and also have threatened to seize producers' farms. A sugar bush refers to a forest of maple trees which is utilized for maple syrup. The maples are tapped for their maple sap in early spring, when the weather has warmed so the daytime temperatures are above freezing. And sugar shacks are small cabins where the sap collected from sugar maple trees is boiled into concentrated maple syrup. And these cabins are often found in the same area as the sugar bush. Around 2016, there were roughly 50 maple syrup producers locked in legal battles with the alleged maple syrup mafia. FPAC inspectors have even gone so far as to use an alias to stage fake illegal syrup deals in an attempt to entrap syrup bootleggers, just like undercover police conducting drug stings. So if you're not on the right side of the so-called maple syrup cartel, they're going to come after you with threats and some hefty fines. Especially if that maple syrup producer skips the FPAC altogether and sells directly to buyers. Steve Cote and his family runs a sugar bush with 25,000 taps. In 2013, the Federation seized his syrup crop when it learned that Cote had sold maple syrup outside of the FPAC's region. The Federation placed 24-hour security guards outside of his sugar shack in 2015 to make sure he handed over every last drop of syrup. He kept up his fight with the FPAC, but lost, and ended up owing over $500,000 in fines. And another producer who went up against the FPAC said to the Globe and Mail, quote, "It's a mafia. Last year they tried to seize my syrup. I had to move the product into New Brunswick at night. This year, they hit me with an injunction." The Federation, however, says the majority of its members are satisfied with the rules, which were set by the producers themselves in the early 2000s. A Federation poll of member producers found that 82% were happy. But in two reports, one commissioned by the provincial agricultural minister in 2016 and another by the Montreal Economic Institute, found that the rules were hurting Quebec producers while encouraging their competitors outside of the province. So understandably, there are a lot of maple syrup producers who want a free market and who have a deep-seated hatred towards the FPAC, especially since maple syrup producers in Ontario and New Brunswick don't play by the same rules, and where the free market thrives. Everything concerning the FPAC basically comes down to money. And when a producer breaks the rules, the fines handed down by the FPAC benefit the Federation and contribute to their overall monopoly and control in Quebec. The FPAC has total control of Quebec maple syrup, which also means maple syrup is really damn expensive. So you're probably thinking all of this is great and everything, but it still doesn't explain why the heist occurred in the first place. What kind of criminal steals a breakfast condiment? Anyone who has to ask that question clearly has never had maple syrup. The stakes of this heist were high because maple syrup is a very profitable business. Back in 2011, 1 barrel of maple syrup was worth 13 times more than crude oil, selling at about $1,300 per barrel. And I found an article from 2019 that states that the value of maple syrup has increased to 25 times more expensive than oil. That's crazy. That's like pure delicious maple syrup gold. Avik Caron knew the value of maple syrup, and with his wife owning the warehouse, he just couldn't resist the opportunity. It was like tempting a kid with candy. Especially since the Federation had just moved 16,000 barrels of syrup into the warehouse, each valued at $1,300 apiece. It was a multi-million-dollar liquid gold stash that he now had the keys to. Avik Caron started putting his plan into action shortly after the Federation leased the former factory. Immediately, he began asking around for the names of black market syrup buyers. And of course, the FPAC had no idea that someone would consider stealing their precious maple syrup reserve, or perhaps they would have beefed up their security. All there was a simple lock and key that Avik had access to. The Federation was in such a rush to find somewhere to store their goods that they apparently didn't think about protecting it, even though the estimated total value was over $20 million. Next, Avik had to figure out a way to steal the maple syrup without anyone knowing. He didn't have any prior maple syrup connections, so he essentially had to find a partner in crime. And then he would need to find a black market buyer to sell the syrup for a profit. This sounds like it would be difficult to pull off considering he really didn't know what he was doing, or have previous black market experience, but as it turned out, putting a team together to pull off a $20 million maple syrup heist wasn't too difficult after all. especially since hatred for the FPAC was intense within the Quebec maple syrup producers community. Plenty of people were eager to rip off the Federation after years of restrictive quotas and dropping competition within the region. By 2011, there was already a thriving maple syrup black market in Quebec. As an act of defiance, rebel sugar makers were quietly selling their contraband syrup on the black market beneath the radar of the Federation. The whole thing was very Al Capone, similar to Prohibition times of the 1930s. Producers would sneak barrels of syrup out of their sugar shacks in the middle of the night to put up for sale on the black market. And if a producer was caught, they faced ridiculously heavy fines and were charged for each pound of syrup sold illegally. Angèle Grenier was considered in the black market trade to be the leader of the Maple Syrup Producers Rebellion. She fought the Federation for 15 years and eventually lost everything, battling the Federation in court. She was fined $500,000 for breaking FPAC rules and had to sell her sugar bush that she had purchased in 1994 to pay an out-of-court settlement and fees associated with her legal challenge. Frustrated with the limitations, she ignored FPAC regulations and began selling syrup illegally to buyers in other provinces. She was even threatened by the Federation with fines and jail time, but refused to stop. Grenier took her case to the Quebec Court of Appeal and finally to the Supreme Court of Canada, but unfortunately was unsuccessful after a 3-year battle. The Supreme Court of Canada refused to take up her appeal. The Federation says that the fines it collects are reinvested into maple syrup promotion and for paying legal fees associated with defending the fines in court. Avik was put into contact with a man named Richard Vallières, and within the maple syrup industry, Richard had a reputation. His position was similar to rum runners during Prohibition times. In the Quebec maple syrup underworld, Vallières was known as a barrel roller, which is the name for these middlemen who broker under-the-table deals between renegade syrup sellers and buyers. Vallières was known for evading the Federation's supply management system to sell syrup illegally, and together with Avik, they were the ringleaders of the group. The two were introduced by a truck driver, Sébastien Dutrust. Mr. Vallières had a history of run-ins with the Federation. In 2007, he was fined $1.8 million after it was determined he had bypassed the official sales agency to purchase 1.5 million pounds of syrup. He apparently tried to get around the rules by purchasing the syrup in 4-liter containers, which producers are allowed to sell directly to consumers. Except he was taking these smaller containers and transferring them into barrels for wholesale distribution. Avik Caron needed an experienced partner if he was going to pull off the job, and Vallières was a veteran in the biz. As a middleman in the industry, Richard had been involved in the illicit maple syrup trade for about 10 years, and had developed a network of producers who would sell to him and buyers who would purchase from him on the black market. Sébastien Dutrust, the truck driver, was also brought on board. The core team for this heist was now established. Avik had the access to the warehouse to steal the syrup, Richard had the black market connections to sell the syrup, and Sébastien, the truck driver, would be the one to move the goods away from the warehouse and assist in transporting them away from the province, far away from the control of the Federation. All they needed now was a buyer for the maple syrup, and that person would be 73-year-old Etienne St. Pierre. He owned a company called SK Export in New Brunswick. He was also another barrel roller who opposed the Federation and their restrictions. And he supported illicit syrup sellers from Quebec by getting their product out of the province. The two ringleaders of the heist made contact with Etienne knowing this. And being based out of New Brunswick, Etienne had the right connections to move large quantities of maple syrup out of the province and into the hands of retail. With the group now assembled, it was go time. So how does one go about moving full barrels of sticky contraband without getting caught? The group started by renting out some space in the very same warehouse. which meant that they had valid access badges and key cards. This also meant that the few security guards on site wouldn't think it was suspicious when Caron, Vallières, and Jutrust arrived in the middle of the night in late 2011. During the fall of 2011, a tractor-trailer began appearing at the Federation Warehouse in Saint-Louis-de-Blandford, Quebec, and loaded up barrels filled with syrup from that spring's harvest. Sometime between midnight and sunrise, they accessed the warehouse and walked straight past their own little storage space towards the section reserved for the 16,000 barrels held for the Federation. They went completely unseen and unchallenged as they moved several of the heavy barrels onto their sides and rolled them out onto the landing area and into Jutrust's truck. The barrels were lifted from the warehouse and onto the truck, and new fake barrels were used in their place. Those barrels had to look exactly the same as the Federation's, since all 4.5 million kilograms of maple syrup was stored in identical barrels. So essentially, they made replica barrels. The group found the same shade of paint for these new barrels, as well as the right sticker that indicated the quality, color, and sugar content, and the Federation stamp that labeled them as an FPAC barrel. This way, absolutely nothing looked out of place. The barrels were then transported to a sugar shack belonging to Raymond Vallières, where the Federation barrels were emptied and transferred into new containers. The empty FPAC barrels were then taken to a nearby creek and filled with water, so it would seem like they were full. And then the group transported all the barrels back to the warehouse. At some point, that same creek froze over during the winter, and then the operation moved into a new warehouse in Montreal in early 2012. At this point in the story, the heist had been going on for about 8 months, and they were getting overly confident. Avik and his team eventually just started draining the barrels right there in the FPAC warehouse in Saint-Louis-de-Blandford. They didn't even move them anymore. They were getting so confident, they just started putting them back empty. Whenever new barrels were originally put into storage, the Federation was attentive in checking and grading the syrup. However, the men knew that previous inventory checks focused on the weight of the barrels, not the contents. The next step was to move the cargo out of Quebec without drawing any attention from law enforcement. To do that, Etienne St. Pierre simply rebranded the barrels to make it appear as if the syrup came from New Brunswick, which has far less strict regulations surrounding syrup production and sales, and sold the syrup to unsuspecting customers who had no idea that the syrup was hot. The syrup also ended up in the US, in Europe, and in other provinces. Avik and Richard actually found a woman in Quebec who would forge waybills to fool US and Canadian border agents, so the syrup could easily be moved out of Quebec, and they kept the quantities low in order to avoid detection. Remember, each one of these barrels was 13 times more valuable than crude oil. And this heist wasn't like a one-and-done heist. No, this plan continued for an entire year. Between July 2011 and July 2012, Avik and his team were able to drain 9,571 barrels and 3,000 tons of maple syrup, worth an estimated $18.7 million Canadian. It was the most expensive heist in Canadian history, and they almost got away with it. The thieves kept going back to the warehouse time and time again to score more maple syrup. According to statements made in court, everything was going smoothly until one night they were caught red-handed by a security guard. The guards came across the men lifting barrels down from the stacks with a forklift, and they stopped in their tracks. They flashed their access passes, but that wasn't enough. They had to explain why the hell they were messing with another company's property. And of course, they didn't have an answer. So the guard reported the ongoing theft to his supervisor. Turns out, the supervisor was in on the heist too, and paid the security guard to keep quiet. But how long could this really go on for? I mean, after a year, the thieves had to know they would eventually be caught. The more immediate concern was the FPAC inspectors. What if they slipped up somewhere? What if a barrel was damaged without explanation? Or what if an inspector actually decided to open one of the barrels? 10 days before the FPAC annual inspection, July 20th, 2012, the thieves were on edge. To communicate with each other, they all used burner phones. All were registered under fake names. Actually, they used Star Wars characters. And these were some of the text messages between some of the accused. July 20th, 9:20 p.m. Quote, "We have a big problem. A guy from the Federation saw the truck." July 22nd, 10 a.m. Quote, "The middle row. We weren't able to put them back in exactly the same place. We have to make the rust circles disappear, okay? For sure, and we will play with the lights so they are low." In July 2012, Inventory Inspector Michelle Gavreau was scheduled to visit the warehouse in Saint-Louis-de-Blandford to audit the FPAC stockpile of maple syrup. Inside, the barrels of maple syrup were stacked 6 high in rows hundreds deep. Each barrel, when they were full, weighed about 620 pounds. The fiscal year was coming to a close, and the Federation of Quebec maple syrup producers had hired Mr. Gavreau's company to audit its inventory. Once a year, the Federation takes audit of its maple syrup reserve. The gap between the rows was barely wide enough to walk through. He scaled the row of barrels and was nearing the top of the stack when one of them rocked with his weight and he nearly fell. Regaining his balance, he rattled the barrel. It was light because it was empty, and he soon found that others were empty. After alerting the Federation leaders and returning with them to examine the syrup stockpile, they removed the cap on a full barrel. The liquid inside was not goopy or brown or fragrant. Instead, it was thin, clear, and odorless. It was water. And that's when Gavreau realized this probably wasn't an honest mistake. And he was right. After closer inspection, he found an additional 30 barrels either empty or filled with water. After that grand revelation, he noticed signs of wear and tear and rust on some of the barrels, even though maple syrup doesn't oxidize. All of this was unusual for containers of maple syrup that should have never left a dry, squeaky clean warehouse. At this point, it was time to notify the FPAC and immediately report the missing stock to his superiors as well as contact the police. And shortly afterwards, there were cops crawling all over the place. The theft was also viewed as an existential threat to the FPAC, which had considered its growing strategic reserve as the final step in stabilizing prices, locking in buyers, and ensuring loyalty from its producers. Over the past decade, it had struggled to overcome opposition to its reign. In a series of legal battles, the local media had christened the Maple Wars. Some observers have suggested that the FPAC's attempts to control the syrup supply had in fact sparked the underground economy. As for the heist squad, they were getting scared. The group knew that their numbers could be traced, so they all had burner phones. But that still didn't work. The police figured it out and retrieved their text messages. As the saying goes, all good things must come to an end eventually. The plot to steal syrup from the Federation of Quebec maple syrup producers had the trappings of a major drug deal. According to Sebastien Dutrust, he twice collected money from buyers for Vallières. One time it was a shoebox stuffed with cash and said there had to be about $200,000 in it. Another time it was a brick of $100 bills in a plastic bag. He figured it totaled about $100,000. He estimated that he made more than $500,000 before the scheme was broken up. The police arrived around the same time as the Federation's own investigators. They were there to conduct an emergency audit and record the damage that was done. The rest of the week was spent painstakingly checking every single barrel in the building. Their jaws dropped increasingly lower and lower, as more and more barrels were revealed to be empty or filled with smelly creek water. The Federation would need 2 months to calculate the losses to the stockpile. 60%, or 6 million pounds of syrup, had totally vanished, worth about $18 million. The bold and baffling heist counted as one of the largest agricultural thefts ever, dwarfing the 12,000 heads of cattle stolen in Queensland, worth about $1.5 million, and the estimated 2,300 kilograms of potato patches the size of a football field that were dug up in British Columbia. That heist had an estimated value of only about $5,000. The resulting investigation was headed up by the Sûreté de Quebec Police, the RCMP, and the help of the U.S. Customs Department. And from the beginning, it was clear that this must have been an inside job. The work of a team with deep connections in the maple syrup industry. And of course, insider knowledge of the rented Federation warehouse. So the police started looking at all the other tenants of the building to see who would have consistent access to the reserves long enough to steal 10,000 barrels of maple syrup. The police first realized that the barrels had very distinctive marks and scratches on them, as if someone had used a forklift to move them. But in reality, the FPAC actually uses a special kind of forklift attachment, so no dents will be left on the barrels when they're moved. So these marks and scratches on the barrels were law enforcement's first lead. The police went to every single forklift renter in the area, and they found a name on a form, Sebastian Jutrust. They knew that Sebastian was a truck driver with maple syrup connections. They called him in to be questioned, and he immediately folded and spilled everything, putting the blame on Avik and Richard and saying that they were the ringleaders of the entire heist, and told police that he had no idea what was going on until he was too deeply involved. He also named everyone else involved, like literally everyone. Anyone who was even slightly involved, Sebastian just gave them up. After the Federation reported the theft to the Quebec Provincial Police, a vast investigation began that would involve interviews with nearly 300 people in the industry, reviews of export statistics, and forensic analysis of syrup kettles, forklifts, and scales, tracing 2/3 of the stolen syrup to companies in New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, and the United States. The information from these interviews were used to obtain a total of 40 search warrants for the homes and vehicles of all primary suspects involved. Avik Caron, Richard Vallières, Sebastian Jutrust, and Vallières Sr., and Etienne St. Pierre's warehouse in New Brunswick were raided, with police seizing $1.5 million worth of syrup. And during those searches, the officers recovered some damning evidence. Police seized vehicles used to transport the stolen maple syrup and executed warrants in Quebec, Ontario, and New Brunswick. Out of the 3,000 tons of syrup that was stolen, police were only able to recover about 450 tons, most of which had to be destroyed because it was no longer fit for consumption. This syrup was found in Etienne's warehouse in New Brunswick, and actually given a police escort back to Quebec. I kid you not. A convoy of 16 trailer loads of maple syrup traveling from New Brunswick to Quebec was accompanied by a squad of provincial police cars. By December 21st of 2012, 18 people had been arrested in connection to the heist, with more arrests to come. Some of the co-conspirators were taking advantage of their last days of freedom and were vacationing in Florida, knowing full well who and what was waiting for them when they returned to Canada. By the time police were finished their investigation, 26 people would be arrested on charges related to the heist. Richard Vallières, the so-called barrel roller, was arrested and charged with the most serious charges: trafficking, conspiracy, received stolen goods, and fraud. In the eyes of the Federation, the theft of the syrup all came down to Vallières, even though he wasn't the initial brains of the operation. The FPAC viewed him as the ringleader because he had always been against the Federation and overregulation. His father Raymond, who was also involved in the syrup industry, was also charged with possession of stolen syrup for the purpose of trafficking. Etienne St. Pierre, who was in New Brunswick, was also charged with fraud and trafficking. And then there were rumors amongst maple syrup producers that this entire thing was one big whacked-out FPAC conspiracy, and that the Federation was really the mastermind behind the heist. The theory being tossed around was that the Federation needed a way to clean out its reserve and collect an insurance payout. A spokesperson for the Federation, of course, denied this, but also said in an interview with the show 16 by 9, quote, "Everyone can think what they want to think," whatever that's supposed to mean. The trials began on Friday, October 21st, 2016. And all jokes aside, the prosecution pointed out that the real victims in all this were the 7,500 maple syrup producers. The syrup didn't really belong to FPAC, it was being held on consignment for the producers. Richard Vallières made a ton of money through the trade of the stolen maple syrup. But instead of taking a plea deal and owning up to his crime, he told the jury when he testified in his own defense he was forced to take part in the scheme because he was held at gunpoint by his co-conspirator and continued out of fear for his life and the lives of his girlfriend and young daughter. He said he wanted out of the operation as soon as he realized the product being delivered to him was stolen from the Federation, and the threats left him terrorized and relying on sleeping pills and alcohol at night. He also admitted to making about $1 million in profit on roughly $10 million in sales from 2011 to 2012. Sebastian Jutrust, the truck driver who ratted everybody out, served about 8 months for his role, and testified against his co-conspirators at their trial. On the stand, he admitted he regularly hauled stolen syrup from the Federation warehouse to sites operated by Richard Vallières. It wasn't long before Jutrust was making weekly runs to the Federation warehouse in Saint-Louis-de-Blandford. Shipments from the Federation warehouse were arranged over prepaid cell phones provided by the buyer, and they were regularly replaced. The phones arrived with a directory of stored phone numbers that were not identified by a person's name, only by a letter. Resentment of the Federation continued to be a strong running theme throughout the trial. But in the end, the jury wasn't buying Vallières' story. And after 2 days of deliberations in Trois-Rivières, Quebec, the jury delivered guilty verdicts against Richard Vallières, Etienne St-Pierre, and Raymond Vallières. Richard Vallières received the heaviest sentence, 8 years in prison, and the court fined him another $9.4 million. He was told he would have to pay the fine over a 10-year period or risk having his prison sentence increased by another 6 years. The other 2 men, Raymond Vallières and Etienne St-Pierre, were each sentenced to jail terms of 2 years minus a day, as well as 3 years probation. Raymond Vallières was also required to pay an additional $9,840 within a year or go to jail for another 6 months, and St. Pierre was required to pay $1.3 million over 15 years or be imprisoned for an additional 5 years. Avik Caron was tried separately the following year in 2017, but the trial was short-lived. He would plead guilty to charges of theft over $5,000 and trafficking stolen maple syrup. At his sentencing hearing, Caron testified that a Federation employee was in on the theft. That employee was investigated by police, but never charged. Caron also testified that unnamed members of the Montreal Mafia were also involved, providing equipment and drivers to keep the scheme going. In the end, he would be sentenced to 5 years in prison and a $1.2 million fine. And even though he pleaded guilty, he had a full-blown rage meltdown in the courtroom when the judge read his sentence. According to the newspaper Le Nouvelliste, Caron said that he had been misled into pleading guilty by his defense lawyer and demanded to be given a trial. When the judge refused, Caron swore at him, banged on a door in the prisoner's box, and fought with a guard who tried to restrain him. Quebec court judge Jacques Lecourcier said Caron's guilty plea made victims of the thousands of producers who rely on the Federation to store and market their maple syrup, and also noted in his verdict that the fact that the thieves transported the stolen syrup in containers not approved for food storage displayed a disregard for public health. Quote, according to the evidence, some accomplices felt sick after tasting the stolen syrup, bringing an end to one of the weirdest crimes in Canadian history. Well, not quite. In February of 2022, Richard Vallières, the barrel roller of the group, was granted parole after serving 7 years and 10 months and after being turned down for parole twice. Vallières admitted at his hearing he stole the syrup to make a lot of money and because he developed a taste for luxury items. but he also revealed he was motivated by his long history with the Maple Syrup Producers Federation. He also said he realized he caused many maple syrup producers to drop the prices of their product when he flooded the market with stolen syrup. In April of 2022, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that Vallières had to pay his $10 million fine or serve another 6 years in jail. He appealed the fine, and the Quebec Court of Appeal reduced it to $1 million. However, in its ruling, the Supreme Court of Canada said the appellate court's decision was wrong, and that Vallières is required to pay a fine equal to the value of the property that was in his possession or under control, which, as he admitted to the court when he was on trial, was $10 million. Richard Vallières had 10 years to pay this fine, and if he can't, back to prison he goes. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to hang out with me. If you enjoyed learning about this case, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button below. To support my channel, you can go to Buy Me a Coffee if you'd like to donate. All the links to all my socials are also down below in the description box. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.